Welcome to the Spectator's Creepy Tales. These are 3 tales of mysterious churches. So sit back, relax, and let the silence fill your abode. Now open your eyes. Tale 1. I was working at a pediatric office as a medical front desk receptionist. There is where I met a custodial worker named Mr. J. He had his own janitorial service in which he would clean the offices after hours. He, along with his 2-man crew, would clean up after the doctors and patients were gone. Now, Mr. J was a tall, chubby man that fit the description of a gentle giant. He never seemed to be angry and smiled all the time. He was diligent in his duties as well. One evening, the doctors had an overflow of patients. It was an evening in which walk-in patients were seen after regular business hours. Therefore, it was going to be between 7 p.m. or 8 p.m. before the office would be closing. As usual, Mr. J came in with his crew and was ready to start cleaning. When he saw that the lobby was still full of little ones, waiting to be seen, he came over to my desk. He asked what was going on. I informed him that the patients were on a walk-ins list for after-hours care. I further stated that it would probably be about 2 hours before closing time. Yet I assured him that the doctors were moving along swiftly. Then Mr. J smiled and said,
"Okay, I'll be in my van and we'll come back later."
About 6:45 p.m. he returned to the office. At this time, all of the patients were in exam rooms and the lobby was empty. Mr. J came over to my desk again. He mentioned,
"You were serious. The doctors did move fast."
Yes, they did. We had a great deal of sick children waiting to be seen. Now, they are all being taken care of and the parents are happy.
Mr. J nodded and he displayed his usual smile.
"Yes, I see. Both lobbies are empty."
I sighed and continued to organize the paperwork on my desk.
Yes, and I'm a happy camper too. It is finally quiet time. Dead silent.
Mr. J stopped smiling and his response to my reply was unusual.
"I would rather have a room filled with noisy people than to deal with dead silence."
I was curious that Mr. J would say that. He was no longer smiling, and he looked so serious. So I questioned him. Why?
"Well, I was cleaning a church, and I had a spooky experience. It was just me and another one of my workers in this church. This was a sanctuary that is located near the historic district. No one else was there. I decided to work upstairs on the 2nd floor where most of the offices and meeting rooms were located. I was vacuuming when I heard noises like people having serious conversations. Although the vacuum was on, I still heard these people talking. I thought that I was alone up there. There was not supposed to be anyone there except me and the one worker downstairs. I do not like to go and clean an office unless the employees are gone for the day. I want to avoid getting in anyone's way, you know. I stopped vacuuming and decided to listen even more. The talking continued. I also thought that I heard someone walking up and down the hallway. Therefore, I left out of the office and decided to go and investigate. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. To my surprise, there was no one up there but me. I thought that maybe it was some passers-by outside. So, I went back to vacuuming. Suddenly, I heard men talking again. I walked out of the office once more and strolled down the hallway. The sound intensified as I heard the men talking like they were having a meeting or debate. I followed the voices until I came upon a room that I had overlooked. A marker on the door read, "Meeting Room." This was a room in which I heard a heated discussion. Apparently, this was where the deacons chose who would pastor the church, organizational issues and other matters of concern. Therefore, they were having their usual meeting, despite the fact that they were no longer of this world. I opened the door, entered the room, and the meeting came to a halt. There was no one inside the meeting room. Yet I felt as if I was being watched. I was surprised and ready to leave the building. Unfortunately, I could not because I had a job to complete. I left the room and then the talking continued. I told my staff member what was going on. He became afraid and felt that we should leave. I told him that we had to complete our job. He replied that it's a bad omen when a church is haunted. I urged him to continue to work for 30 more minutes, and then we would leave. He wasn't happy, but he went back to work. I must say, I was scared too.
I was astonished to hear Mr. J's story, especially about this particular church. It is a historical black church and is still active today. I do believe that the deacons are still in charge even after their death, but that's not the end of the story. Years later, the mention of this church was in a conversation from a friend. I didn't tell her what I knew about the ghost, but she told me and my mother an extraordinary story. The former pastor of the ghostly church passed away, and the church accepted another pastor to succeed in his place. Well, the new pastor made a lot of changes. He eventually stole money from the church and caused much dissension. Schisms caused the church to be in an uproar. Eventually, the new pastor left the church and established a new ministry. Half of the members of the former church followed him. About 3 to 6 months later, the pastor died of heart complications and his church closed. Apparently, the deacons got retribution for the stolen money and the division in the aforementioned church. My friends, remember to respect the old churches that you enter. Angels are assigned by God to watch over places of worship. However, we never know what residual energy may be taking place in these historical institutions. With love and respect, be careful.
We have plenty of room for you, Pastor.
Tale 2. There is a church in the midsection of Savannah, Georgia that is very spooky. I don't know what is up with the place, but the Spirit of God is not there. Don't get me wrong, I am a Christian and have been for a long time. However, this incident will make one aware that some ministries are counterfeit. I remembered reading in the Bible, in Revelations 2 and 9, when the Lord addressed the church of Smyrna. He said that there were some that called themselves Jews, however they are not, but are the synagogue of Satan. It all happened when someone invited my mother to a place that helped seniors with aid for a variety of necessities. Being that she is a senior citizen, this made her eligible for assistance. Well, my mother found the church, but she did not know which office to enter. So she parked her car. She sat for a while and looked at the church. She saw an office where business or church matters were probably handled. Yet the lights were off. Then she saw what looked like the sanctuary area. No one was around to instruct her on which building to enter. There were no signs to direct visitors where to go for senior assistance. So, my mother got out of the car and walked toward the sanctuary, hoping to find someone in there. When my mom entered the place of worship, she was only in there for 2 minutes before she became really nervous and fearful. She could hardly breathe, and dread overcame her. She was astonished because she has been a Christian ever since she was a young adult. Never had she been in a church that was spooky and seemed like a void of anything godly. Therefore, discernment revealed to her that she was on forbidden territory. Besides, the place was very dark and had an air of mystery too. My mom left the sanctuary immediately. Then she saw another senior who directed her where to go for senior assistance. When she returned home, she was tense and nervous. At the end of the day, she had taken ill. My mom told me of her experience, which was terrifying. My mother told me that there was no one outside to tell her where to go for senior assistance. She said the office appeared to be closed and the only area that seemed to be open was the sanctuary. She went inside and was overwhelmed with dread. She said the overall atmosphere was dark. The pews were black, and the carpet was red. The platform, or what we call an altar, was erected higher than normal. Furthermore, the seats in this area were black as well. The podium was positioned so that the orator or pastor would look condescendingly upon the congregation. The walls were dark, and appeared to be black as well. It may have been a dark brown paneled wall, but in the darkness of the sanctuary, the walls and pews were black. The curtains were a scarlet red hue, as if it was dipped in blood. The hardwood floors were very dark too. Mom further stated that she felt as if something was pushing her out of the sanctuary. She said that the place of worship appeared to be a place of judgment. In other words, a godless church. Mom told me that it was difficult to describe her experience. However, she said that it looked like a medieval church where evil things occurred. This place alarmed my mother so much that her blood pressure elevated. As a result, she had to go to the emergency room. Her blood pressure was extremely high, and she had a fever. Later, my mother told me that she even had nightmares about that church. Needless to say, I wanted to determine what it was about this church that terrified my mother. So, one day I visited the place. I walked inside the sanctuary and could go no further. Something or some type of presence stopped me at the door. Although there was no one in the sanctuary, I felt that I shouldn't go any further. Everything was just like my mother said. God has blessed everyone with some type of insight. I discerned a religious spirit, some form of sorcery, and a diabolical presence. The church was very dark even during the day, just like my mother expressed to me. The sun was shining bright outside, but the interior of the building was extremely dark. Most of the windows were stained glass and red was the dominant color. Then I recalled a scripture. In the book of Exodus, there was a plague of darkness, and the Bible revealed that this darkness could be felt. The darkness in this place could be felt. What I sensed was not of God but sheer evil. It was a culmination of all things sinister. Just as my mother said, the platform and podium were a couple of feet higher than normal. It appeared as a cunning effort for the pastor and pulpit associates to loom over the congregation that sat in the pews. Therefore, when the pastor or priest delivered a message, he looked down from a superior position to those sitting in the pews. This area seemed like a place of judgment, and I determined that there were lost souls who were doomed here. Someone was either teaching heresy, or they had an unholy alliance with a person outside of the covenant of God. The historic district of Savannah is where homes, businesses, and parks were constructed over burial sites. This is a fact. So what bones lied beneath this church? Possibly an individual or mysterious factions, under the guise of church auxiliaries, had access to the church unknowingly and practiced curious art forms. Some traditions or rituals that are not supposed to be done in the place where the Lord said should be a house of prayer. I must say I was overwhelmed with dread and fear. I forced myself in and stood next to a pew. Then I felt like I was being watched and that someone stronger than the one by the door was coming towards me. I could hear the floor creak as if something unseen was anxious to confront me. I left that church quickly. God did not tell me to go there. I went of my own accord, and I realized that I was on forbidden territory. When I looked back, I saw no one. However, the small windows and the doors showed nothing but darkness. I must admit that I was scared. When I returned to the car, I told my mother that the church was infested with evil spirits and could be haunted. I became sick and I had nightmares too. Yet, I didn't go to the emergency room. I prayed and asked the Lord for guidance. I also prayed that whatever is going on in that church would be put to an end. I experienced headaches and blurred visions too. I also realized that something was trying to push me out of the church, and it came in the form of air. Yet the ultimate stronghold in that sanctuary was coming when I came in and stood next to a pew. I could hardly breathe, and my heart was racing. I will never go back to that church again, and my mother didn't go back too. I never had an experience like this, so I called and spoke with a mother in the church that I attend. Mother Ella told me that there are some churches that have a form of godliness but denies the power. In other words, the church was a cover-up for something dark. I agreed. There is something very dark about that church. I'm not saying that it's a church that promotes Satanism. However, this is a place in which the worship is not true adoration. Real worship draws people and not push them out. Only secrets keep people away. One night a friend and I drove past the church. The place looks welcoming, but I know that something evil is on the inside waiting. My grandfather was a pastor, and he always warned his church members to pray before they go to fellowship with other churches. There are some places in which the presence of God is not there. This is the result of willful sinning through evil covenants, greed, sexual immorality, doctrines of devils and more. At times the Spirit of God may no longer be in the pastor. The spiritual covenant between the Lord Jesus and that pastor may have been severed. Yet he or she has refused to step down but continue to operate in the office of a leader. Prime example, the presence of God had left King Saul and an evil spirit, sent by God, possessed him. Because of Saul's willful disobedience, the demon became an attachment. However, Saul remained a leader, and he was still able to prophesy. Strange, right? If the pastor is out of the will of God, he is operating under the guise of an unholy spirit. Those who remains in his ministry will succumb to the sinful behavior operating through that pastor. As a result, evil spirits will oppress those individuals, and they will experience depression, confusion, nightmares, and phobias. Their children will act out in school, affecting their grades and their upright reputation. Relationships will face turmoil such as divorce of couples who were married for years. Worse, fornication as well as adultery will be the seducing spirits that will impose on the congregation of the former house of God. I have witnessed it. My mother and I overcame the effects of that dreadful church. It made us more aware that looks could be deceiving. So be careful where you go to worship or fellowship because you may gain an attachment of the wrong kind.
Tale 3. This incident occurred when my Aunt Phoebe and her children came to town. My aunt and my mother was reminiscing about living with their grandmother, which was my great-grandmother Sadie. Although they shared their moments of growing up in the once rural area of Liberty County, Georgia, my siblings, cousins, and I enjoyed every aspect of their memories. Well, one day we all decided to go to our childhood church, which was not too far from my grandmother's old house. As we walked towards the back of the church, we talked about the old building and how decades later, it was still an active ministry. I attended a program at the church, and as the congregation sang old hymns, the echoes heard in the sanctuary was a reminder of the stories that my mother shared with me. Although one could tell that the church was aged, the historical value and rustic appearance of this place of worship was a nostalgic moment. My mother and aunt told us that they used to walk to church morning and night to attend services and often had to walk down the dark road at night. At times my mother said that my great-grandmother would turn on the flashlight occasionally so that they could jump over sticks in the road. This was to ensure that there were no snakes lying in wait. My mother also told me that on the way to church and upon returning home, Grandmother Sadie would pray and repel whatever spirits that she heard lurking along the way. She had the ability to discern evil spirits, and she did not waste time pleading the blood of Jesus over herself and her family. When sounds were heard in the nearby woods, Grandmother Sadie would rebuke the spirits, and whatever was in the woods, my mother and Aunt Phoebe heard it running away. Well, my great-grandmother transitioned years ago, and we decided to visit her grave. Surprisingly, I discovered that my great-grandmother was buried behind the old church. My family and I walked to the rear of the church where the small cemetery was. There we saw 3 graves. My great-grandmother's grave was in the middle. We read the epitaph and talked about how much she was missed. Suddenly, we noticed that there were signs that someone was digging up sand from her burial site. It was only where she laid to rest was the ground disturbed. There were holes around her grave. The man that she was married to before she transitioned was buried next to her. He was an evil man, however, his grave nor the other grave was unsettled. Apparently, someone was coming to the area at night and removing some sand from around my great-grandmother's grave. I always felt that it had to be someone that was familiar with her. Perhaps it was a family member that lived in the area. Yet neither my family nor I understood why a person would do such a desecration. The sand was probably used in a ritual. We all was praying and saying, "May the Lord deal with the person that is doing this." Suddenly, as we all stood close to my great-grandmother's grave, we all became overwhelmed with a sense of dread. Something was approaching. An evil spirit did not manifest for us to actually see, but we all knew that something showed up. Our suspicions and concerns about the holes around my great-grandmother's grave lured something. It was a diabolical being that was upset upon discovery of the sacrilegious deed done to my great-grandmother's grave. Without warning, mosquitoes and flies appeared from beyond the nearby bushes and began to attack us. A dark presence was perceived by everyone, and it was somehow forcing us to leave the burial site. This evil presence followed us until we all returned to our cars. We all determined that someone practicing the dark arts was removing dirt from around my grandmother's resting place. The person responsible possibly summoned a spirit that some would call a watcher. This evil cemetery being watched over those 3 graves. Unknowingly, it listened to us. Upon us praying, this spirit became angry. It stirred up the flies and mosquitoes to drive us away from the gravesite. This was a very eerie experience for all of us, and we never returned to that burial site again. As mentioned before, that church is still an active ministry. Yet, they may not be aware that there is a dark entity that haunts the graves behind the church. Or do they? Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. This is to ensure that these videos can be seen by others. Also remember, the spectator is always watching and listening for another story to add to the creepy tales.